who is the defense's, Dr. Castillo is going to be the next witness for the defense. Who's the witness to follow? Mr. Mizrahi, I understand the situation you're in, but the only thing I can do is continue this matter for you to consider it, and that's not going to happen.
Well, I did. I wasn't moving. The state solution is our point. Right. I mean, he can testify to everything. I just don't understand why all of his testimony all of her testimony should be in the PowerPoint format. Since I have not read all of them.
Well, let me propose this. I will ask the defense to call the subsequent witnesses first. I will give Mr. Mizrahi some time to take a look at the list, if you would like to do that, Mr. Mizrahi.
I have it. The problem is I'm cross-examining your witness. Next witness. Doesn't really solve the problem. The whole problem is what we're going to have.
Well, okay.
The PowerPoint's almost a lot of slides, but there's like 5 sentences on each slide. It's not as if it is a 100-page book. They're slides. They're ideas on the slide.
Well, I was about to ask, is the witness going to stand up there and read every PowerPoint? I mean, every slide? That just, you know.
Some of the slides like are progressions, right? They'll have like diagrams and then a block gets moved off each slide. It's 5 slides that would take 30 seconds to get through, and she's of course not going to comment. But it's more demonstrative than a reporter topical.
I will say this, Sean. I'm skimming through the slides. Some of this stuff, depending on the old condition, talks about how witness culpability, his responsibility is decreased versus guilt phase versus penalty phase.
Mr. Mizrahi, that's an objection you can interpose whenever the witness starts talking about it. I mean, that doesn't mean I'm going to prevent him to use it. I'm concerned that the state didn't get any of this information. I will accommodate the state to the extent that I can. But I'm not prepared to continue the matter, and nor preclude the defense from, using this. I will. Are you going to be doing her examination? I will have no hesitation in suggesting that you move things along during the course of her testimony, Mr. Johnson.
Your Honor, I would state that for some leeway in cross-examination on this issue.
Well, as I said, I'm going to accommodate, the state to the extent that I can. I mean, recognizing that this was dropped on you, what, an hour ago? Or
Dropping me while I was making I was trying to work. I was about to. I had nothing to do. You're right.
For the record, I apologize that I really got it all the live last night. I was after whatever's work. We've been making stuff last minute throughout this
guys.
Your Honor, I think the court has already done it. I appreciate it. They have sent me a list of mitigators before. It occurred to me that I would be unable to prepare for closing arguments if I didn't know what the court was going to instruct me. So I was going to make a motion to have this provided to me.
I sent the proposed verdict form to the state, which includes our list of mitigators. Of course, I sent it to the Rodin, you're subject to change based on the evidence presentation.
Okay. Well, I mean, clearly, as we discussed earlier, he was going to get it at some point before, So, thank you. All right. What other issues then? I'm sorry. I was just saying, what other issues?
That was it.
Dr. Castillo, and then, all right, do we have a jurors yet? Any chance? Mr. Mizrahi is,
I have it in digital form, if the court wants that copy.
oh, that's what I was asking. Can I keep this if you, okay. Okay. Oh, coming in, okay. All right, well, we'll be at ease for a few moments. Our last juror is only just now arriving in the building downstairs at the security point, so. proceed. Mr. Mizrahi?
Thanks, Ryan.
Mr. Johnson? Have the jury join us, please. Mr. Mizrahi, Ms. Johnson, Ms. Simpkins, sidebar, please. All right, the jury is returned. Be seated, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Being in the defense's case, Mr. Johnson. Dr. Castillo, please. Dr. Castillo, if you'll come to the center here in front of me to the clerk and take the oath, please. Please join me on the stand.
Watch your step here.
Mr. Johnson.
Good morning, doctor.
Good morning. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to.
Take your time.
The, oh, got it.
Doctor, could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hi, my name is Dr. Jennings Castillo, and I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist licensed in Florida.
Okay, and where did you do your psychology training?
So I did my bachelor's degree at Florida International University. Then I did my master's degree at Barry University and my doctoral degree at NOAA Southeastern University.
Okay, and did you do any internships as part of your doctoral psychology degree?
Yes, I did. So the internship, which occurs after one finishes the doctoral degree, I did it at the state hospital, South Florida State Hospital, doing forensic and clinical evaluations with individuals who had clinical and forensic issues.
Okay, and what proportion of your cases throughout your career have involved cases within the criminal justice system?
So towards the beginning of my career, I focused a lot on assessment and treatment, and that was more like 20% were forensic, but now it's more like 90 to 95% of forensic cases.
Okay, and have you testified as an expert in court before?
Yes, I have.
And have you testified for both the defense and the state?
Yes, I have.
Okay, and how many times have you testified?
So I've testified about 11 times for the defense and 8 times for the prosecution and 4 times on behalf of children.
Okay. Now, are you currently employed as a psychologist?
Yes, I am.
Okay, and what's your current position?
So I'm in private practice. I've had a private practice since 2018. And what I do is I do forensic psychology, which is the application of clinical psychology to forensic issues. So I assess defendants, and then I present my findings through a report or in a court of law. So that's one of the things I do. I also do employment evaluations on a contractual basis. And I like to stay doing some interventions. So what I do for that is if there are any emergencies in the workplace, I'm contracted to go. So if there is a shooting, a suicide, or something traumatic that happens, I go and talk to the employees. I also do pro bono evaluations for Physicians for Human Rights. So that's free of charge. I do immigration evaluations for that.
Okay, so what's the difference between a clinical psychologist and a forensic psychologist, just to be clear?
So clinical psychology is the study of abnormal behavior. So we assess and treat mental illness, things like depression and anxiety. And as a clinical psychologist, a person can end up in a hospital, can end up in a university teaching. Some people just do assessment, which is mostly what I do. Some people do interventions, and some people do a little bit of everything. Forensic psychology is the application of that science in a court of law. So I regularly find myself in a court of law talking about, is this person competent to proceed to trial? What is this person's level of risk to commit violence and things like that.
Okay, and are you licensed to practice psychology?
Yes, I am licensed in the state of Florida.
Now, have you done any specialized training in psychological trauma?
Yes. So psychological trauma is really overrepresented in clinical populations. So you're going to find it in individuals with substance use or domestic violence issues and many other populations. So that was a strong interest of mine. And what I did is I did a one-year training at the Veterans Hospital dealing with individuals with PTSD. I also did something called TRIP, the Trauma Resolution and Integration Program. That was a clinic in the university. What we would do is we would treat and assess individuals with histories of psychological trauma, particularly childhood abuse, which is a special type of trauma. And then I would receive trainings every week on that. I've completed training in terms of exposure therapy, how to treat individuals with trauma. I do continuing education credits, so trauma is a big interest, and I do a lot of training on that.
Have you also conducted research?
Dr. Castillo, would you move, I'm afraid that your testimony is being distorted in the background. Would you either raise the microphone a little bit enough away from you or back away, where it still can be where you can see the screen on?
Yeah.
Go ahead, try again, Mr. Johnson.
Okay. And I was just asking, and if you keep your voice up and speak nice and slow, have you conducted any research in trauma?
Yes, so as part of the Trauma Resolution and Integration Program, I was doing original research on psychological trauma, especially on the areas of emotional reactions to trauma for adult survivors of childhood abuse. I did a dissertation, which is also an original study on the issue of trauma and emotional regulation and emotional unawareness. And I presented this research in national and international conferences for 5 years.
Okay, doctor, and do you have any publications?
Yes, so I co-authored a book chapter on dealing with defensiveness with somebody who's also a trauma expert, and it was intended for individuals who have histories of trauma, how to deal with that defensiveness that comes in interviews. So, and then I published some newsletter articles on issues of race, trauma, sex offenders, and different topics.
Okay, and have you conducted any other work related to trauma or forensic psychology in general?
Yes, so I was the director of clinical psychology, the director of clinical training and forensic services in a forensic hospital. A forensic hospital is where patients go when they are incompetent to go to trial or not guilty by reason of insanity. So we would assess and treat them in the hospital, and I would also be in charge of a team of psychologists and a team of postdoctoral residents or predoctoral interns. I had to teach them and also assess patients. I was also the director of psychology at the Miami-Dade County jails. And now in my work, I work across 7 states doing these types of evaluations.
Now, have you held any position which involves training or teaching students?
Yes, so I was an adjunct instructor at Barry University, and I taught different courses, including supervision and biological basis of behavior, and then also as the director of clinical training at the forensic hospital. And I still do training, so I did one last week for Bridgewater, which is another forensic hospital in Boston.
Okay, and have you worked specifically, and you may have touched on this, but have you worked specifically with incarcerated individuals who have a history of trauma?
Yes, so like I said, trauma is really overrepresented in clinical settings and in the legal system. So you're going to find an extensive history of trauma in a lot of the defendants. So yes, I worked in the jails, in prisons, and in forensic hospitals.
Judge, at this time, I would offer Ms. Castillo as an expert in the field of psychology with a specialization in trauma.
Ms. Wright, any questions on that?
Dr. Castillo, is there literature related to the impact of childhood trauma on adult mental health?
Yes, this is not a controversial topic. We know that childhood matters, trauma matters, and that what happens to us in childhood, especially traumatic events, have a long-lasting influence in people's mental health.
So when did you become involved in this case?
I became involved on February 18, 2020.
And how did you become involved?
I was called by Mr. Garland, who was an attorney at the Office of Criminal Conflict and Civil Regional Counsel.
Okay, and what were you asked to do?
So I was asked to assess the presence of adverse developmental factors in the life of Alan Wade, and what would be the significance of these factors in his psychological functioning and behaviors throughout his life.
Okay, did you prepare a PowerPoint presentation to aid your testimony?
Yes, I did.
Can you see it up there on your screen?
Yes, I'm trying to figure out how to go through the slides. So.
I have to control it.
Oh, you have.
This particular slide is being copies during freedom matters.
And Judge, she's just can you see the screen? I have to control it.
Oh, you have the control. Okay.
So can you explain how you would approach an evaluation of moral culpability and how this is different from an evaluation of whether Alan is responsible for the conduct in his offense in a guilt phase?
Okay, so for the guilt phase, what we call a sanity evaluation, a criminal responsibility, I would have to assess Alan, decide whether he has a mental disorder, and whether that disorder, the presence of that disorder, had an influence at the time of the offense in such a way that he didn't know right from wrong, or there was some element of the offense that was missing. So the question that I would have to answer is, could he control himself? Did he know right from wrong? Did he have a choice? Because if he didn't have a choice, then an element of the offense wouldn't be there, right? And what did he do? So these are all guilt phase issues, and that's not what I would address in a moral culpability assessment. In a moral culpability assessment, we look at what diminished his control. So I cannot offer an opinion as to what is his level of moral culpability. That's up to the jury to decide. What I'm here to do is to talk about, from a psychological perspective, what are factors that diminish his control, what shaped his choice, because he had a choice, otherwise we wouldn't be here. But what shaped his choice, what shaped his morality system, and how did he become damaged?
Judge, may I approach? I'm going to see if if the remote will work for her. I'm just not sure if it'll reach that far. But let's give it a try.
Good. Go ahead.
Can I?
And if you just touch the screen, it'll clear the red mark off.
Oh, I'm trying, but it's making it worse.
Top right corner.
Is there a model that describes the relationship between damaging or adverse factors, choice, and moral culpability?
Yes. So moral culpability, which is what my evaluation addresses, even though I cannot offer an opinion on the ultimate issue, is the idea that people don't come to life with the same psychological resources and the same experiences. So people who do the same thing, the same crime, might have different levels of moral culpability in accordance to the amount of psychological resources they bring, the amount of strengths, resiliency, adversities. So people have a choice, right? And that choice rests on our experiences, right? So the person always has a choice, but the person with less adverse developmental factors has more of a choice than the person with less adverse developmental factors.
Okay, so before I ask you questions about your specific evaluations of Alan Wade, you acknowledge and accept that he is in fact guilty and had a choice in the murders that he committed?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and if he has a choice, then what difference does his history or background make in helping a jury determine his culpability or blameworthiness?
Because we don't all have the same choices.
Okay. Can you explain how we don't have the same choices or why?
Okay, so first we talked about the damaging factors. When a person has a lot of damaging factors, that is going to incline that person's choice towards negative outcomes. So it doesn't mean that the person doesn't have a choice. The person always has a choice, but it's going to be a different choice because damage is going to move the person towards damaging factors. So that person will have less moral culpability.
Excuse me, noted overruled.
Okay, so this, when we make our choices and we have a very strong foundation, let's say that we have an intact family, that we don't have addiction, that we have a positive childhood environment, that means that we have a strong foundation. And when we make decisions, we make the decisions based on that. Then we have other things, like, for example, consistency in our life or structure in our life. And those things get in the way between a person and damaging factors, right? So this person, this type of person with a strong foundation and with a lot of positive influences, is very unlikely to move ahead to the other side of criminal activity, drug overuse. It could happen, but it's a leap to get there. Now, the more damaging factors that we have, the more that person is inclined towards negative outcomes. So we know, for example, that childhood maltreatment is related to violence in adulthood. So we know that these childhood matters put the person at a different trajectory. And if a person has less of protective factors, the person is more likely to move to the other side towards the negative outcomes. So ultimately, this person has a choice, but he has a different choice than this person has.
Now, isn't this ramp just about making excuses for someone's behavior?
No. So the way we understand risk science in psychology and the way the U.S. Department of Justice understands risk science is that there is not a single factor that will result in violence. It's the accumulation of risk. So the more risk factor a person has, the more likely that person is to move to negative outcomes, including violence. And somebody with a lot of protective factors and few risk factors has a lesser risk, and this is the nature of risk science.
Okay, so what does the Department of Justice have to do with this?
So the Department of Justice, one of the things that they do is they're very interested in reducing criminal offending and violence. And one way of doing that is locking people up. And another way of doing that is preventing violence in the first place. So they do a lot, they sponsor a lot of studies with different universities in terms of what causes violence. And they assess children, and they look at factors that even before a child is born make a difference. And then they look at the childhood, and then they look at the community environment. So the U.S. Department of Justice has identified factors that have to do with violence.
Okay, and what are adverse developmental factors?
Adverse developmental factors are bad things that happen to individuals.
Okay, and so in conducting your evaluation of Mr. Wade, did you meet with Mr. Wade?
Yes, I did.
Okay, when and for how long?
I met with him a total of 16 hours. So I met with him on March 4th, 2020 for 5 hours, March 6th, 2020 for 2.5 hours, and then April of this year, April 25 for 4.5 hours, and April 26 for 4 hours. That's a total of 16.
Okay, and did you speak with anyone else who knew Alan personally?
Yes. I met with his mother, Frida Gainey, in person on 2020, on March, for an hour and some minutes. And then I met with her on the phone for 35 minutes recently. I also spoke on the phone with Mr. Alan Wade Sr., his father, with Nicolette Craig, who is his ex-sister-in-law. She used to be married to Robert. And then Patricia Hayward Page, who's his sister, and Jerry Gainey, who's his stepfather.
Okay, and did you also review records related to this case?
Yes, I did.
What records did you review?
So I looked at the trial transcripts, I look at the penalty phase testimony, and then I look at some documents like a GED that he obtained, dissolution of marriage, some things like that, Baker Act court records, which means that he got involuntarily committed to institutions. I also looked at the record of Mr. Michael Jackson,
Okay.
and school records.
Okay. And as you evaluated Alan's life, looking for adverse developmental factors, were there any particular areas that you focused on?
Yes, so I looked at transgenerational adverse developmental factors. These are factors that go from generation to generation, influencing individuals. I also looked at neurodevelopmental factors. These are factors that impact the way the brain works. I also looked at family and parenting factors, which is issues having to do with the parents. I look at community factors, and then I look at this other category, which is called disturbed trajectory. And this is the idea that we're driving down a road, and we're going in a path, and something happens that moves us out of the road. So all of these other factors, the transgenerational, the neurodevelopmental, parenting, and community, cause the disturbed trajectory. For example, Somebody who has neurodevelopmental issues like academic difficulties, trouble paying attention, may end up dropping out of school, and that's a disturbed trajectory factor because now that person is out of the developmental mainstream.
So how do you select these particular areas?
So these are the areas that the U.S. Department of Justice and psychological science focuses on when they talk about risk for violence.
Okay, and before you talk about Mr. Wade in detail, could you provide the jury with a context or a reference point of how healthy development is supposed to work?
Yes. So brains and skills are something that we really develop over time. So when a baby is born, the brain is not fully formed. The brain becomes more complex, right? And one good example of this is emotional development. If we talk to a kid who is 4 years old and we say, you cannot go to a park, the kid will say, I hate you. And that's how the kid will act, right? The older we get, the more we experience emotional blends. And we know, I'm disappointed at what you said, but I still love you. So that's an emotional blend. And we're only capable of that as we age, right? So brains develop over time. We know that the brain is not fully formed in certain areas well into their 20s, into people's 20s. So when the brain is developing, it's more susceptible to influence because it's still in the developmental process. We know that circuits in the brain, pathways, become stronger when they get used. So it's kind of like that idea of use it or lose it, and neurons that fire together stay together. That means that if a brain grows in an environment of love and support, that brain is going to experience pleasure and exploration. And if a brain grows in a place that is frightful and unsupportive, that child might experience isolation, and parts of the brain might not even develop correctly. So parents do scaffolding of skills. So parents are that support that kids need for the brain to develop appropriately. And those relationships with parents have to do with all areas of brain development, from paying attention to regulating emotions. So as the brain grows, it becomes more interconnected. So if a child is being helped in school, that child might develop good processing skills and complex social skills. But if that child is not stimulated, that child could go ahead and even develop an intellectual disability from neglect, right? An intellectual disability. And we know, and this is for healthy development, that relationships are a main ingredient for the brain development. And that means that the brain is essentially a social organ. The brain needs relationships to be formed. So it's kind of like a serve and return interaction. If you're in a tennis court, the child is born to interact. The child is born to laugh and make the parent fall in love with him or her. And then the parent is responsive to that. So that communication is what strengthens those connections so that the child can develop appropriately. So relationships shape all aspects of development, the way we react and the way we think about ourselves and others. And children of responsive parents form very strong, secure attachments.
Okay, so you say children of responsive parents develop secure attachments. Can you tell us what attachment is and how it develops?
So attachment is the psychological connectedness between two people. It's a fancy word for love. Attachment is really about love. And is a building block, it's an essential component of personality. Attachment is the way two people bond, right? And it's very important, especially in the first years of life for the child and the mother or the father. So what happens with children who are securely attached is that they develop a sense of comfort and they internalize the way relationships are supposed to be. So if we go to a restaurant, we kind of expect somebody's gonna come, sit us at a table, bring a menu. So you develop a script of how a restaurant works. Well, we develop a script of how life works and how relationships work and who we are based on this attachment. So if my parent is very responsive to me, I'm gonna have a very positive view of myself. And I'm gonna have a very positive view of other people. And if I'm in trouble, I know that I can trust my own ability to get me out of trouble, and I can trust others, and I'm going to seek their help. So that's how securely attached kids act.
Doctor, does trauma and adversity impact everyone in the same way?
No. So first, these risk factors and trauma and adversity is kind of like when you cook a stew, no two stews are alike. So people who go through the same negative experiences might have different problems. Some people might develop depression, some people might develop anxiety, some people might become violent, so it's very different. It's also very important to look at the developmental stage of where the person experienced the trauma. So we know that early trauma has a more negative impact on the brain. If I were to be assaulted today, I might change the way I view the world, and I might think the world is not safe. But I still have psychological resources that I developed throughout my life. A child doesn't have those psychological resources. So what happens is that the child fails to develop those resources, and trauma that happens in childhood when the brain is developing can leave a mark. You can think of it as the concrete is wet. So things that happen in childhood are going to leave more of a mark than if they happen in adulthood where the brain is fully formed. Well, the brain is not fully formed. I mean, we're always developing, but it's more susceptible to influence. And also we know that experiences decide whether the foundation will be strong or not. So that's why early experiences are so important. And when we have toxic stress, just like something is toxic to the heart, something can be toxic to the brain. When we have a lot of stress that is happening and nobody to support us and understand that stress, then brain development doesn't occur the same way. And the other way that you can look at it is a house. If a house has a strong foundation, you can go ahead and build the next part. But if the foundation is weak, then the whole house will collapse.
Now, before we begin talking about Alan specifically, can you introduce us to his immediate family?
All right, so his mother is Frida Wade, now Gainey. His father is Alan Wade Sr., and then his siblings are Patricia and Hayward Page. She's 15 years older than Alan, and she's from her father's previous relationship. And then Robert, who is his brother from Frida's previous relationship, and then Andrew, who was born of Alan and Frida.
Okay. And what was your first area of adversity that you identified in Alan?
So I looked at transgenerational factors, which are factors that go from one generation to the next. And I looked at his mother's depression and depression in the father's family.
Okay, and so before we begin, and maybe you've already done this, but have you already told us the members of Alan's immediate family?
Yes.
Okay, so can you tell us about the first transgenerational factor, mother's depression?
So Frida Gainey told me that she suffered from depression even before she was diagnosed with cancer, and that depression became worse as she had to undergo several treatments. And Alan saw his mother cry and be depressed, so she suffered from depression.
Okay, and how about depression in the father's family?
So in the father's family, the father seemingly had mood swings. He would punch open holes in the wall. He had difficulty controlling his temper. And there is a paternal uncle who was severely disabled. He wouldn't do anything. He wouldn't leave the house, and he suffered from depression as well. So Patricia, who's the sister, Frida, and Alan Wade Sr. all told me that depression runs in the family of the father.
And why does it matter that there are mental health problems in Alan's maternal and paternal family?
So we know that there is a strong genetic factor with depression. So individuals who are depressed are more likely to have family members who have been depressed. And there are ways in which we pass that vulnerability. It's a genetic vulnerability in part, but also it's a modeling. So if we see that our mother is giving up or crying, and we see that our father things are not working for him, we model behavior as well. And also is the idea that a damaged person can damage another person. So it gets transmitted from generation to generation.
Okay, so what's the second area of adversity that you studied?
So I looked at the neurodevelopmental factors. These are things that impact the brain. And I looked at psychological trauma and chronic or intense stress, drug use beginning in childhood, academic difficulties, and problems with attention, decision-making, and immature judgments.
Okay, so before we talk about trauma and chronic or intense stress, can you describe what psychological trauma is?
Psychological trauma is exposure to an event that threatens us. It can be caused by sexual violence, by something that threatens our life, death. Trauma is something that happens to us or that we see happen to other people. And what psychological trauma does is that it overwhelms and dysregulates the nervous system. And it really changes the way in which we view the world. So we might feel less safe in the world. And trauma is a reaction that then we store in the body. And when we react to things later on, we feel that reaction. It's less of a memory, and it's more like a way of reacting to the world in a very fearful way.
And how can, how can childhood trauma impact someone psychologically?
So the first thing that trauma is going to do is attack the attachment system. And we talked about that psychological connectedness between us and our caregivers. So when we feel afraid, one of the things that comes to our mind is, I want my mom. I want someone to take care of me, especially for a child. And when that parent doesn't get there, it disrupts attachment. So then the child learns, nobody's gonna come to aid me, and I'm not efficient. So in a child, trauma can really deform the personality. It can deform the way in which the child views himself. It can make him give up quicker. It can also change the way in which the child is able to regulate emotions. Trauma elicits a lot of strong feelings, a lot of fear. And children who undergo trauma might not go back to baseline. So once they become scared, it might take them hours to return to normal. They might not return to normal. Trauma impacts the way in which we view the world. It impacts the way in which we feel safe. It makes us more vulnerable. So trauma impacts all aspects of psychological development.
Okay, and how can childhood trauma impact someone socially?
So, because individuals with trauma have a lot of attachment difficulties, especially in childhood, they might internalize this map of, I'm not good, I'm not a worth human being, but this other person is good. So I'm gonna attach to this other person, and I'm gonna do whatever this other person does, so this person can give me some love and acceptance. So these individuals may become very vulnerable to other people, to people that are more predatory, to toxic relationships. They might be in a bunch of like love toxic relationships, for instance. So they're more vulnerable. And also because they have a lot of anger, this may create conflict, but pretty much vulnerability.
Does childhood trauma impact people biologically?
Yes, so psychological trauma is a very biological process. So there are different ways in which this happens. One is the fight-flight stage, which we know, if we encounter danger, our body is going to release certain hormones, and then our legs are going to become strong, and we're going to become more focused and ready to fight, freeze, or leave the situation, right? Well, what happens is that the brain has a system that says, okay, I'm going through this very powerful surge of hormones. Now it's time to stop, because if those hormones keep going, they're gonna damage systems. So like they could damage your heart, or they could result in a lot of conditions. So the problem with individuals who have chronic trauma is that response is on overdrive. So the part of the brain that assesses danger is always on. And the person is always like scared, looking for danger. And then the part of the brain that thinks through things and considers things is not there. So when we go through a scary event, we cannot sit and consider our options. Like pretty much our brain gets hijacked by this emotional piece.
Okay, so pertaining specifically to Alan, did you discover any psychological trauma and chronic or intense stress that you underwent?
Yes. So I found instances of physical abuse, of sexual abuse, witnessing neighborhood violence, and being beaten and shot at These are specific traumatic incidents. And I also found intense stressors that are also very chronic, and even though they're not like traumatic in the sense that they don't cause that, they don't involve the loss of life, for example, right? But they are very harmful, and they can lead to the same kind of damage that trauma can lead. And so dysfunctional home environment, childhood maltreatment, and the losses. So he has a friend who dies by suicide, and he loses a lot of important attachment figures. This is a theme of his life, that he cannot keep these people, his father, his sister-in-law, his sister, and Theresa Rodin.
Tell us about Alan's experiences with physical abuse.
So physical abuse is the intentional use of force against somebody, usually from a caregiver to a child. And Frida Gainey indicated that she used to hit him, and that she used to hit him with objects, and he also indicated the same thing. Somebody doesn't need to hit with objects for something to be physical abuse, because physical abuse is something that has the potential to harm, to intimidate, or that causes actual harm. So that was his experience with physical abuse.
And are you aware of Alan's experience with sexual abuse?
Yes. So there is a point in Alan's life when they moved to this place called the Water Club Apartments. And Alan's is about 6 or 7 when they moved there. And he's walking around by himself. And this is a very marginal neighborhood. So when a child is unsupervised, walking by himself, things are bound to happen. So what ends up happening is that there were a lot of sexually deviant individuals in that complex. There was this guy, Sean, who was about 7 years older than him. And he pulled down his pants, performed oral sex on him. And he sexually abused him multiple times. Alan says that he felt like garbage, that he felt very scared. There was also a babysitter who was about 16 years old, so an older adolescent, and she used to make Alan perform oral sex on her and touch her and things like that. And the babysitter she used to put scary movies, so he would seek her comfort. So she was using that attachment, that need for attachment and connection, to really sexually abuse him. Then at around age 7 or 8, he's going to church, and the pastor's son starts sexually abusing him. For Alan, this is the most traumatic of the incidents, because he said that this man was very aggressive. So the man would abuse him in the open. So like, let's say that Alan was walking from a class to the next, or in the middle of the hallway, he used to like shove him against the wall and start touching him and kissing him and doing sexual things to him. So he felt very aggressive. But also, this is somebody that everybody trusted and that he himself trusted at the beginning. So this was very difficult for him because it affected his spirituality, his faith in God and his faith in the church. And then he was abused by different adult women. So at some point, he's forced into being homeless, and he ends up with these women, and some of them are taking advantage of him sexually.
Did Alan witness neighborhood violence?
Yes. So at the Water Club complex, people were selling drugs, they were beating each other up. He witnessed actually a drive-by shooting. He was in the school rec yard, and there was a drive-by shooting. People being attacked, and Frida indicated that the neighborhood was very rough. And neighborhood violence and neighborhood decay, there was a lot of sexual acting out by the kids there.
How about Alan being beaten and shot at?
Yes, so he told me that he was jumped and beaten multiple times by peers. So Alan had this problem, so he goes to the Waterhouse apartments. There is a lot of African-American people, and he's hanging with some deviant peers. Then when he goes back to a more rural area, they are making fun of him because they're saying that he's talking black. So he's caught in between, like, the white kids don't like me, the black kids don't like me. And he's beat up multiple times at the Water Club apartments. So Frida indicated that there were times in which he would have to, like, when the bus from school brought him, he would have to run to the house, not to be beat up. But he was beat up frequently for many years. At times, he would even try to, like, leave the bus, like, stops in advance to avoid being beat up. And in McLeany, at this time, he already is developing drug addiction. So there was a lot of marijuana, and there were marijuana fields, actually, and he would go into them to take marijuana to support his addiction, and people were shooting at him.
Did Alan experience losses?
Yes. So he had a friend named William Davis who died by suicide around age 16 or 17. So Alan indicated that this kid told parents something like he wanted a car, he wanted to borrow the car, and the parents said no, so he shot himself, and he died. And Alan said that it was very distressing. He was a very good friend of his, and also kind of like an indication that they were doing a lot of reckless things, and that was so important, to borrow the car, that this happened. Alan didn't know how to deal with this, so he just did a lot of drugs and drank a lot, and he didn't know how to process it. And Alan lost a lot of important attachment figures. It's very distressing for him that he's losing his parents, his mother, sister-in-law, Theresa, not to death, but pretty much they're not in the picture for him.
Okay, and I just want to back up and clarify something you testified about previously. When we talked about the sex abuse that happened in the church, that was not the church in McClenny. That was in Daytona, is that right?
Yes. So he's younger, he's a young kid, and he's experienced this sexual abuse. Later on, he goes to McClenny where he meets Pastor Schwartz, and then his experience was more positive there with Pastor Schwartz, but by then he really didn't trust what was going on in the church. Yeah.
Now, can you tell us about the effect of drug use beginning in childhood?
Yes. So he tried drugs maybe a little bit before, but by age 12, he's already drinking, he's smoking marijuana, and he has this friend named Derek. And it's very interesting because Alan really wanted to attach, and he really wanted to attach to male figures. So he really idealized Derek, and Derek was very cool, and Derek is my friend, and we're gonna be this team that we're gonna be together. And Derek told Alan, he was older, he told Alan, you cannot do hard drugs, right? So he would smoke marijuana and drink alcohol with him, but you cannot do hard drugs. So Alan saw this as, this is what separated me from Derek. I'm gonna show him that I can handle this. So his use of drugs is really an attempt to fit in that later becomes an attempt to cope with pain. But initially is, I really don't want anything to separate me from Derek. And it really talks about the way adolescents really favor friendships and really want to do things to please them. So he did things like mushrooms, Xanax, painkillers, cocaine with older friends, other drugs. And the way he puts it is, I would take any drug to escape from my life. I wanted to be absent from feelings and reality. So he's really trying to numb all the feelings. And he told me that he didn't truly feel feelings until he was in prison away from drugs. And he said drugs were my refuge.
Now, did Alan have academic difficulties?
Yes. And this is important because when we look at the way adults work and adults function, we tend to look at the job. How are you doing at work? If you're not functioning at work, that signals that you're not doing well. So when we look at children, we're actually looking at school. How are they doing in school? So Alan was doing okay in elementary school, but sixth grade, his grades drop. And what is happening in his life is his parents are separated, and then they go through a divorce. His father is not coming around much for whatever reason. There are many reasons offered, but the father is not coming around. He's moving into these areas where there is a lot of drugs. He wants to please Derek. So there is a lot of things happening. And when he starts using drugs, his grades really drop. He would actually drink alcohol in the morning and go to school. He was falling asleep in class. So it was very difficult to function. Also, Frida starts kicking him out of the house by age 13. So now he's homeless. And then he failed sixth grade 3 times, right? And at some point they put him in 7th grade without finishing 6th grade. So there is a lot of educational difficulties that he's having. So he's homeless, so it's difficult to do well in school when you have to be thinking about what am I gonna eat, There were points in which he's boiling water to drink water, not to be hungry. living in the woods. So he's retained in 6th grade and 7th grade, and by 8th grade, he drops out of school. He's getting Fs, you know.
Did you discover problems with attention, decision-making, and decision immaturity?
Yes. So life in general requires for us to have a lot of moving parts. So even something like a relationship, we would need to take care of our needs, make sure the person doesn't get offended, follow rules. So for us to do all of this at once is very complex, and it's kind of like the analogy of an air traffic person that is trying to like fly planes and land planes. Is very difficult. So he's having trouble managing, which means he's having trouble keeping friendships, which means he's having trouble controlling his impulses or making recent decisions, in addition to the fact that he's an adolescent too.
Can you talk about youthfulness?
Yes. I'm sorry, I didn't finish, I realized. So he said, I was uneducated on how to act. Nobody taught me what to do in social situations, how to handle socioeconomic differences. I had no tools to work through life. I didn't know I had options. So he is not really capable of solving complex issues. Alan and Frida also said that he was impulsive and he was immature. Jerry also said that he was immature, more so than other kids, lagging behind peers. At some point, he has a girlfriend and then meets her years later, and he's like, oh, she moved on and she did well, but I got stuck in the same place. He didn't know how to get out of it. And he was constantly engaging in high-risk behaviors like drugs, dangerous situations, and he had a lot of car accidents.
And you talk about youthfulness.
Yes, so we know that individuals, children, right, and adolescents are more immature than adults, or less capable of making mature judgments. So some of the things that are happening is that the way they look at risk and reward are very different. So as adults, we think, oh, I'm not going to engage in this because this consequence might happen, and that might prevent us from doing something. But for a kid, the reward is more powerful than the risk. They don't really look at the future in that way. They don't really think of consequences. They don't even enter their mind. So they're really driven by their desires, and they're very vulnerable to external influences. So because the brain is developing and they have like this dependency on others. So kids are more likely to do stupid things just because there is a friend around, even if the friend is not asking him to do the stupid thing. So they will just want to impress other people, and they will like succumb to peer pressure in the way that adults don't have that vulnerability.
Would this apply to someone 47 days past their 18th birthday?
Oh yeah, look, that's just the way the law looks at it. And a way of looking at it is, okay, so you can vote, I think, at 18, you can drink at 21, but insurance companies, when they're going to give you a car, that is gonna be very expensive, the insurance, until way in your 20s, because they know that you're probably gonna crash the car, or like that you're gonna drive recklessly. And the ones who have it right are the insurance companies. They study risk, and they know that kids are overrepresented in all risk. They're so strong, and yet they're so immature. And even if they're smart, you can have a kid in Harvard who is doing very well and dies of alcohol poisoning because they're doing a lot of stupid things regardless of how smart they are. It's more about maturity that they don't have. And also we know that their character is not fully formed. There is no personality in kids. Personality is something that we don't even diagnose a personality disorder until after the 18th birthday, because we know that everything before is they're experimenting and they're trying different hats and they have different predilections. So this pattern of behavior, this personality is not formed until adulthood.
Can you tell us about parents' mental health issues?
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
I just wanted you to talk about the parents' mental health issues.
Okay. Yes. So this is part of the family and parenting factors that I looked at. So the father had mood swings. He dealt with life through anger. And mom would go from being stoic to being very angry. It seems that Frida didn't really express a lot of feelings, but when she would, she could be impulsive. And she suffered from depression. And at times, she was like checked out from her depression, like not aware of what was going on around her.
Can you talk to the jury for a moment about childhood maltreatment?
So childhood maltreatment is something that a caregiver does or fails to do that results in harm. So we have three types of abuse: physical abuse, psychological abuse, and sexual abuse. But we also have another side of maltreatment, which we don't talk about a lot, but is the most prevalent form, which is neglect. Neglect are things that a caregiver fails to do that cause a lot of damage. So for example, physical abuse would be hitting a child, something that the caregiver does, an act of commission. Physical neglect would be not giving the child a place to live, not giving the child shelter. Psychological abuse would be something like saying you're stupid. Psychological neglect would be never reacting and never taking care of the child emotionally. So the things that we don't get are as important as the bad things that we get.
And so of those 9 childhood maltreatment experiences, how many, if any, did Alan have?
He had almost all of them, except for medical neglect. He had all the other. He had physical, psychological, sexual abuse, physical, emotional, educational neglect, inadequate supervision, and exposure to dangerous environments.
So, can you talk about Alan's experiences with psychological abuse?
Psychological abuse is conveying that a person is not okay, that is flawed and damaged and not worthy of love. So mom would say things like, you're throwing your life away because you're stupid. So she would personalize things with him. Also, Jerry Gainey, he really wanted to protect Frida. So I have, like from my conversation with him, he was more of a tough love kind of person. You're gonna get killed, you're gonna go to prison. But these things do damage to a kid too. So when he's undergoing these issues of with psychological abuse, he starts doing cocaine. And there is something that is very harmful and that he talks a lot about. Mom is diagnosed with breast cancer, and he's very worried about her. She has a mastectomy, she's undergoing treatment, and then she tells Alan that he's the cause of her cancer because of the stress it's causing her, and that he has to leave the house. So that's a big impact, because now my mom is gonna die, which is the way he internalized it as a kid, and I'm the one causing that.
So, before we get into this factor, can you explain how emotional neglect compares to abuse in terms of being psychologically damaging to a child?
So psychological neglect and all forms of neglect, they're as harmful, and in some circles they say it's even more harmful than abuse. If you ask a lot of trauma survivors, what is the one thing that haunts you the most? And that person was sexually abused and physically abused, they will say, the fact that my mom didn't say I love you. So they will always mention neglect. And for Alan, when I asked him about what haunts you, he also said that neglect was the worst part of his life. So neglect makes the child not develop appropriately.
So could you just describe the impacts of childhood neglect then?
Yes, so like we talked about the fight, flight, freeze response. For a child, not having a connection, being neglected, being invisible, elicits that trauma response. So the same trauma response that is elicited if we were walking in the woods and there was an alligator coming, the child feels that when the parent doesn't respond. If you take a baby and the baby smiles at you and you keep a still face, it's not that you are intimidating the baby, you just keep a still face and don't respond, the child is going to start crying, because the child is failing to connect with you. So this is a very powerful thing. Being rendered invisible makes us not develop. And if we don't have that mirror of our parents, we fail to understand our own emotions, because the way we develop emotional awareness is by the parent being a mirror. Oh, you're scared, this is what you do. Otherwise, you grow up to be an adult who, I don't know what I'm feeling, because I never had anybody mirror myself.
And
so.
Why is it that emotional abuse or neglect can sometimes be more harmful than physical abuse?
Because neglect and psychological neglect, it's an attack on who you are, on whether you deserve a place in this world, on whether you are effective. So it's going to impact the way you view yourself. the way and it's going to impact the way you process things. So neglect and abuse, they're really on a spectrum, right? There's people who get neglected like 100% of the time, and people who get neglected never, and it's a spectrum. So at a high spectrum level, if you take a kid and you don't hug, kiss, or talk to that kid is going to become intellectually disabled. So we know that children who are reared in institutions and are never touched become intellectually disabled. They fail to thrive. So at a lower extent, you fail to develop appropriate social skills. You fail to understand that you have a place in the world and that you're a worthy human being. You're invisible.
So can you tell us about the psychological neglect, specifically with regard to Alan?
Yes. So Patricia, who's the sister, indicated that their house was pretty divided. He indicated that Frida showed favoritism towards Robert and Andrew, and Alan felt like a third wheel in his own house. So one of the things that he said is that Frida had a very good relationship with Bruce Nixon, and Bruce Nixon at some point lives in Alan's house, and Frida is taking care of him, and so he didn't understand, how can my mom take care of him and not of me? Or why is he doing well in my house? Why is he thriving in my house and I cannot thrive in my own house? So that's an issue of psychological neglect, of being unresponsive. And he said that that was hard and hurtful.
How about educational neglect?
Oh, sorry. Like he indicated, his parents were not affectionate. Frida acknowledged that. And he said the whole family was emotionally immature, and she could really appear sensitive in front of other people and wasn't. And one incident that was significant as I was looking through the records was Brian Dobson, who was the assistant principal of a school. He saw that Alan was having problems, and he talked to Alan, and he said, this is what I read from the testimony, that he called Frida and said, parents love their kids unconditionally. There is a difference between being irritated and not liking a kid's behavior and really not loving the kid. I think Alan really needs to hear that you love him. And she said, I cannot say that. And there was silence. So she couldn't say she loved him. And that was very distressing. The way he described it, it was heartbreaking. And he was crying, which was unusual for Alan. And Patricia said that Frida acted sometimes like he was an inconvenience. And these are his words. Neglect was the most hurtful part of my childhood, even counting the sexual abuse. It was hard to see. Nobody was there to love and protect me.
Can you talk about educational neglect?
Yes. So Alan said that he wasn't doing well in school at some point, and then they didn't even realize that he needed glasses, and that's what was going on. So they put glasses on him, and his grades improved. Then he's pulled out of school to be homeschooled. So Frida is homeschooling him. But at the same time, she has a very strong work ethic. So Frida goes through cancer, through treatment, and she's working. And they modify her work, but she's always working. She has a good, strong work ethic. But at the same time, she's homeschooling him, and she's not there. So he's experiencing neglect. At some point, he goes with the sister, and the sister asks Frida to send the papers, and she doesn't send the papers. So he's not doing well in school. So those are instances in which nobody's really guiding him and getting him the help that he needs in school to do better.
And generally, did you discover a lack of guidance and supervision?
Yes, and this is the idea, of course, that a kid is being unsupervised and neglected. And what you see is that this happens a lot with kids of depressed parents. So it seems to me when I talk to Frida that she was so depressed. It was so hard for her to function. That's what was going on, right? She was trying to function, and it was very difficult. So Frida would leave Alan with Robert, who's the older brother, who had a substance use issue, to take care of him. The older brother would sneak out of the house. And at this point, this is what Patricia said, Dad would go to work early morning, and Robert would sneak out. And when I would wake up to my 3-year-old, 4-year-old brother at my chest, hungry. So Patricia, who's staying there temporarily, is taking care of Alan. She was about 19 or 20, and she would even take him to work with her. Also, his brother Andrew is taking care of him. Now, Andrew has an undiagnosed Asperger's disorder, which Asperger's disorder is a type of autism where individuals have difficulty understanding social cues, so they're higher functioning. Now in the DSM, we look at all autism as autism, but it used to be in the previous DSM. So these are individuals who are very socially inappropriate. Something is off and weird about them. So he babysat Alan. So Alan said, I was watching my brother more than my brother was watching me. Andrew had odd behaviors. He had difficulty functioning, according to Patricia. He used vulgar language, made sexual suggestive thrusting moves when he saw a girl that he liked. So he was just socially inappropriate, and he was the one taking care of Alan. And this is, of course, how Alan ends up going through the water club apartment complexes and getting abused. He wanted to be like Andrew. Even though Andrew had all these problems, Alan didn't understand that at the time. And he was taking his social cues from him. Also, he indicated that Frida would tell him, don't do this, do that, but she wouldn't tell him how. How do I go on accomplishing that? And that's very important for a kid. There was a girl in his house. There was a party because he's unsupervised, and the girl almost died from alcohol poisoning. She walked into a wall, and then they called the rescue, and she almost died from alcohol poisoning. So, like, the neighborhood is wild. Things are pretty chaotic around him. So he was not getting supervision. And when I spoke to his father, the father said, after the divorce, I wasn't there. So I hardly know what was going on in the house. Yes. So the father is not there either. Yeah.
So was Alan exposed to dangerous environments?
Yes. So this is a type of neglect that involves allowing the child to be in violent places. So the water club apartments were very violent, and he's being exposed to all of this. At age 5, the house that Frida and Alan Wade Sr. have goes into foreclosure, and that's how they end up living in these apartments. So it's right next to a canal, and he will go fishing by himself. He almost drowned at around age 6. So he's by himself walking, and even when he's out of the bus and walking, not to be beat up by other kids, he's seeing prostitutes, he's seeing drug dealings, he's seeing shootings, so it's pretty bad. He's sexually abused by multiple people.
Now I'm objecting on the last part of this. I'm objecting to the slide.
What basis?
One, according to the previous slide, there was one perpetrator in the apartment complex. Now it's both.
That's not true.
I'll leave it at Go ahead.
Can you tell us about the separation and divorce of Alan's parents?
So Patricia and Frida told me that there were arguments between her and Alan Wade Sr. And when Alan is about 8 years old, the parents separate, and she moves with Andrew and Alan to McLeany, and with her sister for a few months. And then from there, they move to a trailer, and they separate.
Did Alan ever experience poverty?
Yes. So after the separation, they moved into this trailer that had holes on the floor. It had a broken septic tank, so there were black waters, and he thought it was mud, so he was playing in it. So it's a very poor environment. His mom was not making a lot of money, so there was not much money to spend, not too much to wear, which means that kids are making fun of him in school too. He's hungry a lot. He ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, noodles, junk food. He didn't have toys like the other kids. And this is a statement by his father. They would not have anything to eat at the house. I would take them to dinner. They didn't have a Christmas if I didn't come. And so Frida was struggling financially, and Nicolette, who's the ex-sister-in-law, Robert's ex-wife, tells me, yeah, Frida was a single mom. She's trying to work, and it's been very hard. And this is in the dissolution of, this is a document that I saw later on. It's called the Order Terminating Child Support. At the time of the termination of child support, he owed Frida $19,000. So she was not getting help either.
Can you talk about the absence of Alan's father?
So this was one of the most destabilizing factors in his life. After the separation, he doesn't see his father that much. The father has a job in Georgia. And so I spoke to the father and I spoke to Frida. So they have the way they experience these events. So the father said that he would drive 3 or 4 hours to see Alan, and he wasn't there, and that she kept the kids from him. Frida says that he wouldn't come, that he wasn't helping. And so Patricia said, the sister, Alan was attached to Dad, and he was a pawn between Frida and Dad. So he got caught in this conflict. He really struggled with the father's absence. So he seemed mad all the time now that his father was gone. There was an incident that was pretty harmful for him, that Pastor Schwartz talked about it, and Frida as well. Father promised to show up, and he wouldn't show up. So that's very disappointing for a child. And at age 11, close to 12, he's hardly seeing his father anymore. He's at the same time living in this community fraught with drugs, and he begins missing and failing classes. He has to repeat 6th grade. So this all goes along with the father is not there a lot, and he's struggling with this. He is using marijuana and alcohol. He's homeschooled. And at some point, the father goes MIA. He's missing from his life.
So can you talk about Frida's experience with cancer?
So in 2001, Frida indicated that she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and then she has to undergo a mastectomy, she has to undergo chemotherapy, she has to take a lot of medications, and she's taking antidepressants. She falls into a big depression, and she's also taking cancer medications. So she indicates that when she starts taking these medications, she develops this brain fog, where she just doesn't know what's going on around her. She has gaps in her memory. She indicated that there were whole years that she hardly remembers what happened during those years. So Jerry indicated to me that cancer impacted Frida a lot. She was trying to work, and she has memory gaps. We call, in depression, when people become really depressed and they cannot think, we call that pseudo-dementia. It looks like you are demented because you really have difficulty remembering and paying attention. So it's the depression with the medication as well. It was so hard for her to deal with things that she couldn't pay her bills because she couldn't open the mail and pay the bills. So she had a friend that would come over and help her out. So she becomes really low functioning. And Nicolette, who's talking to her on the phone, that's Robert's ex-wife, says she was out of it, like it was like she wasn't there.
So how did Alan cope with his mom's cancer?
So Alan indicated that he was devastated by his mom's diagnosis. Patricia told me that Alan was freaking out because he was going to lose both parents. He felt like he didn't have a father, and now he was going to lose his mom. He went to a session, either chemotherapy or radiation, and then he cried for what felt like an hour. And he worried a lot that she would die.
What about Alan's relationship with Jerry, Frida's new partner?
Yes, so Frida starts dating Jerry, and when Alan meets Jerry, there is a confrontational introduction. So when I spoke to Jerry, he told me he's an old-fashioned person. He was taught to believe that you should respect your elders and things like that, and he loved Frida, and he wanted to protect her. So he saw Alan as someone who was being disrespectful, someone who was hurting Frida. So in a sense, he's part of the group of people who are saying, you need to keep Alan away from you. So when he meets Jerry, Jerry said something like, there's gonna be some new rules, and Alan talked back, and Jerry grabbed him by the neck. And Frida didn't do much. So the relationship was not like a father-son. It was more like he was dating Frida, and she would stay with him out of the house, but he was not living with them, and it was not a positive relationship.
Now, when Alan was young, was he always resistant to authority when he was in a structured environment?
So one of the things that Jerry told me is that he felt, well, Alan doesn't respect authority. He doesn't respect the elders. However, when I spoke to other people, I realized he did very well when he had authority, care, and structure. So for example, this is Nicolette. He spent the summer with her, I think in Connecticut. She said he was a big help, he behaved well, he carried groceries, he worked with Robert, he was not disobedient, he was not disrespectful. So he was a very sweet kid. That's the way she said he was. Then with Patricia, his sister, she said, Alan behaved very well. He was obedient and respectful. Then Theresa, in the penalty phase, said, he was very polite, he was very respectful, he did everything that I asked him to do, he was a good kid. And then Pastor Schwartz said, Alan was always very respectful, I've never seen him jump out in a fit of rage or anger or anything like that. So he was doing well at church, he was doing well with the sister, he was doing well with the sister-in-law, and he's doing well with the stranger. As long as he has authority, care, and structure, he does well.
So what was the fourth area that you identified?
I looked at community factors, and these are things that are in a person's community.
And can you tell us about Alan's negative church experiences?
So Frida went to a Pentecostal church about 3 to 4 times a week, sometimes more. And Alan becomes very disturbed. So by this time, Alan is being sexually abused. And he doesn't know how to handle this experience of being sexually abused. So now they're talking in church about heaven and hell, and people are going to hell, and people are bad. And he doesn't know how to process this information. He's having a lot of negative thoughts about himself and the sexual abuse, and he thinks he's going to hell because he was sexually abused. So he starts running into walls and hitting his head to remove the thoughts. So when that happens, people thought that he was possessed. And so they start doing what he calls exorcisms. They are like praying for him and yelling, and they're walking barefoot, and they're pushing him, and they're like pushing his chest so hard, like CPR. So he fell scared to death. He indicated that this is one of the worst parts of his childhood, was this experience in church. And Pastor Schwartz indicated in his testimony that Alan is one of the few kids that they couldn't really make a connection with. And Alan indicated that the reason is that he didn't trust the church and people there.
How about Alan's exposure to neighborhood violence and criminality?
Yeah, like I said before, in the water club apartments, there is a lot of dysfunction, illicit activities. There is a man who raped his stepdaughter, and she was pregnant by him. There is a car that they bring, and everybody's destroying this car, and he's part of this, and they call the police. So there is a lot of chaos, criminality, and violence. And then in McLeany, there is a lot of drugs.
Was Alan beaten, bullied, or experienced rejection?
Yes, so Alan is excluded by other kids. I mean, he's taking his social cues from Andrew, so he doesn't know how to act. He's acting like someone with autism, right, in socially inappropriate ways. So he indicated that kids didn't like him because he spoke black, and then the blacks didn't like him because he was white, so he couldn't fit in anywhere. And then he's beat up at the water club apartments like we talked about. And yes, and we discussed this. He was beat up many times.
Was Alan's brother Andrew bullied or beaten up?
Yes, so something that Frida told me is that they will pick on Alan because he was related to Andrew. So, we know that kids can be cruel at times. And because Andrew had a disability, they were actually picking on Andrew. And then Alan felt compelled to defend his brother. He talked about an instance in which they're beating up Andrew, and Robert, who's 7 years older, sees this and doesn't do anything. And it made him think, man, in this family, nobody stands up for one another. And he's like trying to go and defend his brother. So he experiences that as well.
So did Alan receive acceptance from older peers?
Yes, so being rejected felt very hurtful for him. At some point, he's going to people's houses, and now the parents don't want him hanging out with their kids because he looks weird and he's acting weird. So older people accepted him. He's like, older people were not petty, so I could hang out with them and they wouldn't judge me, right? They didn't expect me to act in certain ways. So he's hanging around with older adolescents, adults, and of course that makes him prey of people who have legal problems, handguns, drugs. Frida indicated that he was always with older kids. Derek was older. And then, this is Pastor Schwartz's testimony, the concerns I had for Alan was that he was always seeking the approval of somebody older, and so therefore the kids thought that the kids that he was with were older because he really craved that father-son relationship.
So, did Alan experience psychological disturbances beginning in his childhood?
Yes. So he indicated that he didn't have a self-worth. I didn't know how to handle being excluded by other kids. Growing up, I lacked self-confidence. I felt sexually ashamed. Church made me feel loathing for myself. I felt abandonment. So there is a lot of that. There is an incident in which there is a ping pong table. That's the last gift that his father gave him, and that's the only thing that he has from his father because his father is no longer in the picture. Frida wants to sell that table, and Alan becomes really distressed to the point that the pastor has to come and talk to him because he felt abandoned. And the key here is that this trauma and this neglect is causing damage to the self. I could actually induce a sense of self-efficacy, like a loss of self-efficacy. If I gave you a problem you cannot solve over and over again, by the time I gave you another problem, you're not going to be able to solve it. And I could, in 5 minutes, make you not be able to solve a problem because you're going to give up. It's an experiment that we do in psychology. So imagine being told day in and day out, you cannot do things. So having that personality undermined. So he has a negative view of himself. He also has emotional disturbances, periods of deep depression. He cannot sleep well. He said that he was depressed, but it was not like crying. It was more like he couldn't get traction. He couldn't get motivated. One time he said he was going to run away and kill himself, which he ends up being committed to a mental institution. He did not expect to live beyond age 16. Definitely not expected to live beyond age 18. Difficulty regulating emotions. He didn't know how to process it. And he felt fear. Afraid of being beaten by peers, scared at church, nightmares about monsters and vortices. Until he was 25, he was still having nightmares. Self-inflicted blows to the head, which you see in people with trauma. They will hurt themselves. And Frida said that she saw him hit his own head against the car window. He also has this social vulnerability. So Frida said that he really wanted to look up to somebody. He wanted a male figure, but nobody stepped up. The pastor said that he looked approval from older peers. He craved love. He wanted to fit in. And people said that he was selfless and really cared for other people more than for himself. He put other people first.
So I think I might have skipped a question, but what is disturbed trajectory?
Disturbed trajectory, like I said before, is this idea that you're going through a road and something happens and moves you in off the road, and now you are in trouble. So by him developing this social vulnerability, that's a disturbed trajectory. That's something bad that happens that can lead to more problems. If he wasn't socially vulnerable, he will have age-appropriate peers. And maybe a teacher will have taken him under his wing. But because he had that social vulnerability, older people preyed on him. And this is a statement by Patricia. She said, Alan was vulnerable. Someone older and mature could manipulate him. He wanted so badly to be loved. He was ripe for the taking, and someone who would take advantage of him. And everybody that I spoke with, they said he was a follower, hanging out with older people.
So can you tell us about Alan's coping deficits?
So he didn't know how to handle emotions. He didn't know how to handle negative thoughts. He kept feelings to himself. That's really interesting too. A lot of the people that I spoke with, they said, I don't have a sense I knew what was going on because he wouldn't express his feelings a lot, in part because he didn't expect anybody to take care of him. So he doesn't have coping skills to deal with the world.
Did Alan use drugs to cope?
Yes. So one of the things that we know about substance use, for one, there is a biological component to it, right? We choose to have a drug, but we don't choose what that drug is going to do to us and who's going to become addicted to the drug. When Alan starts doing drugs, he realizes, I don't have to feel pain anymore. So he said, I used drugs because I didn't have to feel any pain when he was high. I was in a complete state of oblivion. Nothing mattered, nothing exists, nothing is real, and nothing can hurt you. And he said, I did not see life without or beyond drugs. So his drug addiction is so extensive that he's using drugs to go to school.
Let's talk about Patricia.
So Patricia is his sister on the father's side, and she realized she didn't know who her biological father was. She had been adopted by her stepfather. When she realizes that she has a biological father, who's Alan Wade Sr., she goes and meets him, and that's how she meets Frida and ends up living with them and spending summers and some time with them. So when Frida gets diagnosed with cancer, Patricia indicated that she wanted to keep Alan, and Frida declined. So that's a disturbed trajectory factor, because if he had stayed with Patricia, maybe there would have been other things that he could have done better. Like the time that he stayed with her, he was hanging around with age-appropriate peers. He was doing well in her house, and she was helping him with school. So even though it was summer. So she said, I feel distressed that I didn't do anything. Alan felt like nobody wanted him.
Okay, and how about Nicolette?
So this is when, once again, Frida is sick. She asked Nicolette to keep Alan for a while, and Nicolette said that she was having too many problems with Robert because he was struggling with his drug addiction, so she couldn't take him because she was trying to save her own marriage. So she said, I regret not having taken Alan to this day. I would have probably done better by him than what he ended up getting.
And so what was Patricia's role in Alan's life?
So Patricia, she indicated that she really loved him. When she got married, she flew him to the wedding and then drove him down. He would spend time with her. So Patricia was one of the few people that he opened up with and talked about his feelings. But then he loses her in the sense that there is a gradual loss of contact after Alan Wade Sr. and Frida separate. Patricia is not in touch as much and she said, well, I was calling Frida. Frida is not home. I'm talking to Andrew. He's playing video games. He's not relating my messages. And Alan must have thought I disappeared and abandoned him. So they lose contact.
And how about Frida's struggles with cancer?
So she, like I said, she indicated that he caused this illness. Mom said I was the source of her stress and I had to leave. I felt terrible. She has breast cancer. And then he refused to leave. He said, no, I want to stay with you. So he said that she threw his belongings on the lawn and changed the lock. So now he was homeless as a kid. And Frida said that her friends and close friends advised her that this was best to show him this kind of like tough love. This was her idea of what was going to make him better.
So can you talk about Alan's experience with homelessness?
So at around age 13, he is homeless, right? So he lives with his friend Andrew Hardenbrook for about 3 weeks. At that point, Frida doesn't go and get him for like 2 or 3 weeks. Then she kicks him out at around 13, 14. He sleeps in a car outside a friend's house. He also slept in an abandoned jail in a mattress that was very dirty. He also slept in the woods. So to eat, he would just like boil water and try to eat, to have that. So he was homeless for many months. And he was bouncing around and doing drugs. Patricia knew he had been homeless. Alan Wade Sr. said she kicked him out. He wasn't even 18. And this happened multiple times. He would come back home and then become homeless again. So Theresa, in the penalty phase, indicated that he ended up living with her. She said Frida would not let Alan stay with her. He was staying with different people, and his clothes were all over the county. He would stay with whoever would let him spend the night there. So he doesn't have any stability, and he's not doing well in school either, of course. And he was trying to go back to school. He had no guidance, no structure, and no anything.
Let's talk about Theresa Rodin.
So he goes to live with her. He first starts staying with her and her husband, and then he moves in. And he bonded with her. So he said she was very well equipped to be a parent. He was in awe of Theresa Rodin. He said, she didn't even have to be there for me to be respectful and behave well. She motivated me to really do good. I felt respected. One of the things is like she was very logical, very transparent. I felt I could trust her. She didn't lie to me. She offered guidance. So she said things like, sex is okay as long as you use consent and protection and this and that. So she was really guiding him. And then she was about to get guardianship of him. And then she asked Frida to contribute financially to his care. And at that point, Frida became very distressed, she indicated to me that she felt really bad that she was losing her son. That made her feel really bad. So she shows up in Theresa's house and begins crying and weeping. And that was very distressful for Alan. She was weeping and saying, "Give me back my son." And she even kneeled. And he said that he had never seen his mom quite like that. And so he felt really bad, but he decided to leave Theresa's house to take care of Frida's feelings. So he said, it was very hard for me to see my mom like that. Against my better judgment, I went back with my mom to protect her feelings, right? And Frida said that looking back, even though it was hard in the moment, that would have been the right decision to leave him with Theresa, because at that point, she could give him something that Frida couldn't.
Can you talk about Alan's leaving school in the 8th grade?
Yes, so he indicated that school became more difficult. He feels a lot of peer pressure, struggling more with drugs, so he cannot get traction in school. At some point, he's being homeschooled, but he's not really being homeschooled. He's getting D's and an F. So he's withdrawn by Frida to do GED classes, and then he doesn't go back to school.
Are there any other experiences by Alan of being forced into homelessness again?
Yeah, so after he leaves Theresa and goes back with mom, she ends up kicking him out again. So he ends up being homeless again. At some point, she moves into an apartment and says, "You cannot move here." And then he moves with 2 exotic dancers who are adults. So once again, he's more vulnerable to sexual manipulation by older women. He's still a child.
Was Alan engaged in some delinquency?
So Alan does not have an extensive history of juvenile delinquency. Like juvenile delinquency is pretty common in adolescents, right? But with Alan, there is not a lot. He was arrested at age 14 and charged with petty theft for stealing a neighbor's bike and scooter. He indicated to me that he did it to buy drugs. So the drug addiction once again. There is also, he's hanging with older kids, and 2 older kids steal some speakers, and he's in the car with them, and so they charge him. And then disorderly intoxication, once again, drugs are at the center, and he's charged with possession of marijuana.
So, can you tell us about Alan's relationship with Michael Jackson?
So Alan indicated that he met Michael Jackson at around age 17. He was really someone that he looked up to, once again, someone who was larger than life, who was very worldly. And he represented money and drugs for him. They used the same word. Alan said he was worldly, and mother thought that he was too good to be true. Frida said that he was like a con artist, like a con man, that he was coming and saying, "No, I really want to help Alan." But soon afterwards, he was threatening Frida. So at some point, he threatened Alan at gunpoint. And in another occasion, he got into Frida's face because Frida was trying to now step up and interfere with this relationship that she saw as very negative. So she said, "Michael Jackson got in my face and threatened to hurt me. He said, 'Go do what you need to do.'" And she said Alan was scared of him. And Alan said Michael Jackson would make threats or say things along those lines. "I was scared because he knew he could pay people to do things to other people to hurt them. So he knew what he was capable of."
So were there some ineffective early interventions that were set up for Alan?
Yes, so we know that even if kids go through trauma, if we intervene early in life, there are things that we can do to help, but he didn't have those interventions. At around age 15, he said, "I'm either going to kill myself or I'm going to run away." He starts running around. This is in the school. They call Frida. They hospitalize him for 24 hours. So they just do an assessment. He's not suicidal, so we're releasing him. So he's not really getting the help that he needs. He needed more than that and earlier than that. Then in 2003, Frida finds drugs. And so she writes this note: "I have found drug paraphernalia in the garage, pipes, razor blades, papers, smell pot. He's not attending school. He tends to have fits where he gets angry. I have to back off." So Frida indicated that she was advised that it was good to involve the legal system, so she does that to have him committed. And when she tricks him into going to this place, she says they're going somewhere else, and when he gets there, it's a court, and they are about to commit him. So he grabs her, and he's like, please don't leave me, please don't leave me. And then they said, do you want to press charges? And she said, yes. So they take him into a room and kick him, beat him, and pepper spray him. And he told Frida later on that they had beat him up. So at some other point, she said the same thing. She was tricking him into going somewhere else, and he jumped out of a moving car because he was just very afraid of what might happen to him. So he goes into Gateway, which is a community center. They say that he has marijuana and alcohol dependence, which means his drug use is out of control and impacting his life. And these are some of the notes. So he gets 6 days of treatment, and then he's released. He needs more than that, right? And then he goes into juvenile detention. They say in court that he's not addressing Frida and the court in a civil manner, so they place him in the juvenile detention center in Gainesville for 1 month. And then mom would not go see him, so he's feeling abandoned. Nobody helped me. And he said that when he goes into this center, he's not getting treatment. He's just being detained and held there in a place with a lot of violence. Then he starts testing positive for cocaine. So he really cannot thrive in this system because he has a big problem with drug addiction. So this is just another example where they order him for treatment. And then mom sets an organization called Team Challenge, and they were gonna kidnap him and take him to a place like a boot camp to scare him straight kind of situation. So they bring a van and try to kidnap him, but it doesn't work. So that never happens, and he didn't even know why people were trying to get him. So those were the interventions that he received.
Did Alan try to join the military?
Yes, so this is one of those areas when I spoke to him, he became very sad and teary-eyed. He really dreamt that the military was gonna be his way out of all of this, like a place that is gonna offer structure, I'm gonna go to school, I'm gonna be a diesel mechanic. So he wanted to join the National Guard, and the day he was supposed to swear in, he tested positive for marijuana, so he couldn't swear in. He was about 17 years old. And not having gone to the army really haunts him because it's like one of those forks in the road. If I had gone there, my life would have been different. Now, after he tested positive for the drug, they said, go ahead, take 30 days and come back. But he couldn't. He couldn't stay away from drugs. And I asked him why he had relapsed, and he said, it was not a relapse. I was using drugs every day, all day, every day. So he couldn't get the treatment, he couldn't leave the drugs, he couldn't do this. But also is that idea of I'm inefficient, I'm ineffective, I cannot do this. I didn't see a future, I would die soon, so what's the point? So he stopped trying, part of the depression too.
What is the ACE study?
So the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, is a study that was done in Kaiser Permanente. It's one of the biggest studies in terms of public health. There was this clinic of overweight individuals that they were losing weight. And as soon as they were losing the weight, they were gaining the weight back. So the research becomes very interesting. Why are these individuals gaining the weight back? So he realizes that there is sexual abuse in the mixed. And they said, I lost all this weight, and now I became desirable to people, so I gained the weight back, so I'm not desirable to people anymore. Then he starts interviewing people, and what he finds is that he interviewed over 17,000 participants, which is huge, We're lucky if we get 50 people to participate in a study. So what he found was that there were 10 events. And if people went through this event in childhood, they were more likely to have very negative outcomes in terms of health, the leading causes of death, like heart conditions and things like that. So people who have ACEs had diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, heart disease, cancer, broken bones. So what he found was a dose response. Out of the 10 ACEs, if you had one, you were more likely to experience these diseases. And if you had two, the people who had two were more likely than the ones who had one. So it was a dose. The more adverse childhood events that you had, the more likely you were to experience dysfunction, mental health, and biological dysfunction later in life. Life expectancy was reduced by 20 years, so people with 4 ACEs or more were more likely to die as adults. And what they have discovered throughout the years, this study has been replicated many, many times because it's an old study now, is that it's not just that people who have these events engage in negative behavior that results in risk factors. So somebody might have cancer even if they don't smoke, because they think there is a biological explanation, that there is inflammation that happens in the body that makes you more at risk, even if you don't display behavior that are conducive to health issues. So these are the 10 ACEs: physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, physical neglect, psychological neglect, parents who were separated or divorced, household members who were depressed, mentally ill, or attempted suicide, living with somebody who has a problem drinking, mother being treated violently, and household member in prison. So those were these factors that they identified, and people who had 4 or more had trouble.
So how many ACE factors did you identify in Alan?
So I, just looking at this, I realized I made a mistake in this slide. So he had 7 out of 10. So the ones that he did not have were living with a problem drinker, alcoholic, or drug user, right? Because I'm gonna be conservative about that in terms of Frida using drugs, right? Mother treated violently, he didn't remember that, and someone at home who was in prison. So 4 or more is negative, he had 7.
Are there protective factors that buffer people?
Yes, so like we said, what you get, the bad things that you get hurt you, but the good things that you don't get, the vitamins that you don't get, are also important. So we know that there are certain characteristics that are associated, that protect you from violence. Being a woman, we know that men are more likely to commit violent acts. Being intelligent, having a positive social orientation, good social skills, being resilient. So some people have more rebound on the concrete. Some people are more likely to withstand the winds of adversity. But that also comes from the outside, from the environment. Bonding with social positive models. Just one person who takes a kid under his or her wing can make a big impact. Healthy beliefs and clear standards of behavior, and effective early interventions. These are things that protect people from violence.
And how many protective factors did you identify in Alan's life?
So I put intelligence as a protective factor for him, and it's plus or minus. So he was at least of average intelligence, but he was so immature that intelligence did not really go a long way for him. In the sense that people who are intelligent, what happens is that they might end up in school with a teacher who really likes him, and it's like, oh, he becomes the teacher's pet, and I'm gonna take him under my wing, and that person succeeds in school, and it's the way out. But with Alan, that was not the case. It didn't help him.
So, as an expert, did you come to some conclusions regarding Alan?
Yes, so my conclusion is that Alan has an extensive history of trauma and adversity, and that this history had a significant impact in his psychological development, and it reduced his psychological functioning and his maturity, even compared to other kids his age.
And so in your opinion, was Alan impacted by trauma and adversity at the time of this offense?
Yes, so Alan was a damaged person by the time of the offense. So he would have been affected by this chronic neglect. And this is the idea of some people have a very clear damage, like a wound that you can take a look at. But people who are chronically neglected, it's almost like starving somebody to death, right? So a person who doesn't have those vitamins, who lacks that support, is also going to be impacted by trauma, and he had a lot of factors that push him towards negative outcomes.
Just a moment. Judge, I have nothing further with this witness.
All right, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Just a moment. There we go. We have been hearing from Dr. Casilla for almost 2 hours now, so it's appropriate to take a short break. I'm going to ask that the jury step back into the jury room. We'll be in recess for about 10 minutes. Remember my admonitions about not discussing the case amongst yourselves. Dr. Castillo, you may stand down, but you are still under oath, and you may not participate or talk to anybody until you resume, okay? And we will be in recess in the courtroom for 9 minutes.